Well, Gabor, thank you so much for joining the Hurt Healing podcast. It's a real honour to have you on today. I think you're probably one of my most esteemed guests so far, so thank you for coming.
Well, thanks. Nice to be here.
Gabor, your most recent book, The Myth of Normal, is just the most phenomenal work and has really opened my eyes to so much and just makes so much sense that I want everyone to read it. Can you start by telling us what toxic culture is and how you define it in your work?
What
toxic culture is?
Toxic culture, sorry.
And
well, we can think of it very simply if we imagine a laboratory where a biologist is growing organisms in a petri dish, and we call that a culture. So we culture these microorganisms. And if the organisms were thriving and reproducing, we'd say it's a healthy culture medium. If they were dying or not reproducing well or develop pathologies, we'd say it's a toxic culture. Now, if you look at Western globalized society from the point of view of how the inhabitants, the microorganisms, such as us human beings, are doing in our culture, we see that it's not very well. The rate of mental illness is rising all the time. Anxiety, depression are becoming epidemic or endemic. Childhood problems like anxiety, attention problems, self-cutting, bullying, depression, statistically are rising here in Britain, in North America, and pretty much through the Western world. There's a rise in a number of people with autoimmune disease, in non-smoking related malignancies, so that if we understand that human beings, just like other organisms, live in a context, and the source of the illness can't just be found inside the individual organism, but has to be sought and looked for in the context in which those lives are lived, then we say this is a toxic culture.
And why do you think that there's, let me reframe it, sorry. Why do you disagree with labeling ourselves as our addictions? So to say, I am an anorexic, I am a drug addict, I am an alcoholic, why is that mistaken, in your opinion?
Well, it may be true that a person has alcoholic tendencies and behaviors and their lives are very much dominated by it, but is that who they are? And is that how they were born? Is that their true nature? Or is that just some behavior that developed for certain reasons to do with their lives? So if you look at alcoholism, for example, alcoholism is very much related to childhood trauma, childhood experience. It's also very much related to social circumstances, such as loss of meaning or purpose, loss of employment, sense of insecurity. In countries where there is severe national historical trauma, like Ireland, for example, alcoholism is a huge problem. So to say that somebody struggles with alcoholism or has an issue with it is not to say that that's who they are. Nobody is that. And it's very toxic to identify people with their dysfunctions. That's not who they are. As much of a challenge as those behaviors may pose for them, it doesn't define them. If it did define them, nor would they ever get better. But the fact is that people heal, which means it's not who they are. And what's interesting, when you talk about addiction specifically, or alcoholism, for example, when people get better, what phrase do we use? We say they've recovered. No, that's a good English word. What does it mean to recover something? I'm asking you.
You unturn it and you turn it around. I guess you've suffered from something, and I'm not sure about the etymology of the word, but you...
No, but never mind the etymology. Like,
you essentially, you reverse a bad situation.
Well, that's one way to put it, but the other way to put it is more simple. You find something.
Yeah.
You lost something and you found it. What is it that people find when they recover from addiction? You ask them, what did you find? They say, I found myself. So that underneath the addiction, there was a self that was lost but never damaged. So how can we say that they are their addiction? They're not their addiction. That's not who they are.
Mm. Do you think, I mean, because that strikes a chord with me because I struggle with an eating disorder.
Oh, yeah.
And do you think you can ever fully recover from a process addiction like an eating disorder or say something like OCD? Or do you think you can, I mean, I sometimes say send it into remission so that it's something that always has to be managed, but it will still exist?
Well, first of all, the word remission implies a disease. And I don't perceive eating disorders as a disease. In fact, I don't perceive a lot of things as a disease that you do, remission and so on. Let me ask you this question, if you're open to it.
Of course.
What does it do for you in the short term?
Control, and it gives me a sense of safety in a very warped way. But the further along in my recovery I get, the more I realize that actually it creates an illusion of safety and it's not reality.
Well, of course. But in the beginning, so the eating disorder wasn't who you were, and it wasn't your primary problem. Your primary problem was lack of safety and lack of agency in your life. And now I would say, so what happened to you to deprive you of safety? Because the eating disorder is just your desperate attempt to attain something that you should have had in the first place. Safety is an essential need of human beings. It's an essential need of the human infant. So, not having met you before, and this is the first time we speak, but I can tell you, something happened in your life that deprived you of a sense of safety. And that's something that happened, probably occurred very early in your life. And so that, then to answer your question, can you fully recover? Absolutely. But not by focusing on the behavior, but by looking at the dynamic that the behavior was trying to resolve somehow. So yeah, if you could find that sense of safety within yourself, and that would take some work, perhaps therapeutic work and other kinds of work, if you find that sense of safety, there'd be no eating disorder. The eating disorder does not exist as kind of a dynamic of its own. It's simply a response. It's one particular response amongst many possible ones to that lack of safety that for some reason you developed at some point in your life.
And it's so interesting, and I know you talk about psychedelics quite a lot, and you've had first-hand experience with psychedelics, and I myself went and had an experience, and it was the first time in my life that alone, when I was lying there, I actually felt a sense of safety in myself. Like I actually experienced this, like I'm safe in my body, I'm okay.
Yeah.
Whereas up until that point, my entire life was spent like running away from this horrible feeling of I don't want to be in my body. I want to run away. And for me, a lot of my way of running away was literally to run and just to run and run and run.
That's what people do.
Yeah. And it's finding that just sense of peace and inner calm. And so when someone says to me, oh, I always have to be doing something, to me, that person, there's something that's not quite right, and there's something slightly unhinged that they need to search within themselves. And I think in this English culture, we suppress and we bury a lot.
Yeah. Well, let's not call it unhinged. It's a perfectly normal response to abnormal circumstances. Mm-hmm. The sense of safety that you found is your true self. What the psychedelics do in the right circumstances, they get you very deep in yourself. And sometimes people find terrible terror and pain and rage under the psychedelic experience. Those are emotions that they've been bearing all their lives, and they have to be dealt with, so it's a good thing that they experience them. But sometimes they get to that place that you got to, which is that fundamental safe of basically internal essential goodness that is your birthright as a human being. And we evolved that way. As I just recently read a book called The Continuum Concept, and it's written in the 80s, and it's American model, and the writer ends up in 6 weeks away from civilization in the depths of the Venezuelan Amazon jungle, living with these Stone Age people. And how they bring up their children is children get this essential sense of goodness and safety because they're carried everywhere, they're held by the adults, they're not chastised, they're loved, they're allowed to be individuals, and they don't have a lack of safety, even though they're living in circumstances that many of us would find disorienting and frightening. But that sense of goodness and safety comes from their sense of relationships with their environment and with one another. So that's what you found. That's your intrinsic nature, actually. Woo-hoo as that may sound, but that is your intrinsic nature. And that's who you really are, not your eating disorders.
No, it's very true. I mean, in this English culture, a lot of people get sent to boarding schools very young, and that was my experience. And I also I never felt that sense of maternal attachment, and that's something that your work really illuminated. And so if you don't have that feeling that you're unconditionally loved, but particularly by your mother, I think it's deep rooted. And again, what the myth of normal made me realize is that I've had a brother who has done no work on himself and who seemingly was fine. However, I'm convinced that actually a lot of his trauma came out in asthma and eczema and physical illness, whereas mine came out in mental illness.
Yeah, well, asthma is a typical example where it's kind of a telling example because how do we treat asthma? I mean, as a physician, I can tell you. Basically, we treat asthma by giving people two hormones. One is adrenaline, the other is cortisol. The adrenaline opens up the airways, the cortisol settles down the inflammation. What are adrenaline and cortisol? They're stress hormones manufactured by the adrenal gland. What happened to your brother is that there's so much stress that his stress mechanism became disabled. And now his lungs get inflamed. Lots of studies showing the relationship between parental stress and childhood asthma. In fact, the more stressed the parents, the more medication the child needs for their asthma. And in the United States, for example, certain racial groups, the more episodes of racism they have to endure, the higher their risk for asthma. So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is your brother's probably one of these very sensitive people. And so the environment affects him all the more, which means that not just the physical environment, but the emotional environment also affects him. And so the asthma is a typical stress-related condition that the problem being is that most physicians don't know what the heck I'm talking about. And it's not because the science doesn't exist, because the science has been there for decades, relating asthma and stress. It's not even vaguely controversial, but most people, if they go to their physician for asthma, all they get is a prescription which is necessary, but not sufficient. I don't know if that answers your question, but in this society, there's so much stress on people. So there's an increasing rate of asthma. Now, there's other contributors to asthma, pollutants in the air and so on, but the emotional factors are ignored.
It's very true. And as you've, tried to do, and I know with like Rangan Chatterjee, as educating, a lot of medical practitioners about the Socratic model and saying that actually, the mental, the physical, you call it the biopsychosocial model, don't you?
Yeah.
And that's just, to me, it makes complete sense. And yet we're living in a healthcare system where doctors still aren't really that up to speed with the mental side of things.
It's almost bizarre because, you mentioned Socrates. He said 2,400 years ago, Plato quotes Socrates as saying that the problem with the doctors of today is they separate the mind from the body. He said this 2,400 years ago. They're still doing it. And the difference is that in the last 100 years or more, we've had so much scientific research showing the inextricable unity of mind and body. That when people are stressed, they get inflammation in their bodies. When people are stressed, they suffer in all their organs. It can lead to disease of all kinds, from autoimmune disease to malignancy to gastrointestinal problems. The evidence is overwhelming, and it's virtually completely ignored in medical education.
And do you think it is changing? I mean, do you have hope that we will get to a stage in, say, 10 years' time where doctors will be more, able to diagnose people with psychological issues? Because I know that when I was first on my journey and my mum went to our local GP and said, I think I've got a child who's suffering with OCD, the GP turned around and said, what's OCD?
Huh. That's extraordinary.
It was 22 years ago, but still.
Come on, I was trained 50 years ago now, I imagine. I knew then what OCD was. So I don't know what lecture your GP missed where he didn't know about OCD or she didn't know about OCD. More the problem is that even physicians who recognize the diagnosis as such see it only as sort of a physiological brain problem rather than as, again, a response to a life experience. Because again, if you look at your OCD, however it manifests, maybe you have a need to wash your hand 99 times before you leave the house, or check the key 55 times to make sure the doors. I don't know how it manifested, but it did something for you. And what do you suppose it did for you?
Well, again, I think it's the control and the safety and the certainty. Because I do remember as a child having these existential thoughts of what is the world? The world is this huge, bleak place. Who am I? I'm this voice in this body. And what is Pandora? And all those questions. And I think when you are a child, as an anxious child who's an overthinker, you try and make sense of the world, don't you? So you try and create something that feels solid. And
well, that's not the first thing you try to do. That's the second thing you try to do.
What's the first thing you try to do?
Something that wasn't available to you. Which is to go to your parents and say, I have this fear, I have this anxiety, I have these questions. And when that's not available to you, then you're sunken on yourself trying to figure all these things out. And then the OCD becomes a way of having a minimal sense of control over some small area of your life, which gives you a sense of pseudo-control and pseudo-safety. Again, it's a perfectly normal response to an abnormal, toxic situation.
Do you believe that when something like OCD, which I think is widely misunderstood, because I think a lot of people's reaction to something like OCD is, oh, just stop it, just snap out of it. Whereas as you identify, you've actually got to go to the root and to regain that sense of inner safety and that I'm okay and I don't need all these rituals and behaviors.
Exactly.
But I think the typical person takes 9 years to seek help for OCD, by which time it's almost metastasized so much that it becomes functionally autonomous in the brain. And so the rewiring process of all those neural circuits is, a task that I'm still having to go through.
I would recommend a book by an American psychiatrist called Jeffrey Schwartz. Are you familiar with his work? Yeah. And he actually talks about rewiring the brain. It's true that when the brain gets miswired, if you like, or wired in the wrong ways early, it's much more difficult later on to rewire it, but it's possible. And that's called neuroplasticity, which is the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits in response to new experiences. So it can be done. It is more work later on. It's true.
And that's why you believe that recovery is possible for everyone, because of this concept of neuroplasticity and the brain's ability to change.
It's one of the reasons I believe recovery is possible. That's one of the dynamics, but it's not the only one. I think inside every human being, there's a deep capacity for healing. Inside every living organism, there's a deep capacity for healing. And the human beings are no exception. It's more complex in our case than in the case of a plant, but it's still there. So it's a question of what conditions will promote that healing capacity to assert itself, and what conditions will inhibit it. And so when you're going to a doctor who doesn't understand you and throws their hands up in despair, or their eyes roll, that's not conducive to healing. And unfortunately, physicians, well-meaning and highly well-trained as they are very limited in their perspective because of the medical culture.
We've spoken about Jeffrey Schwartz, and do you think that because you talk about the 4 R's, don't you? About relabeling and reattributing.
Yeah.
And will you elaborate on those? Because I think that's something that's very interesting in creating that distance between, ourselves and what we're going through. Because actually,
Yeah. So I stole that from Jeffrey Schwartz.
Yeah.
With his permission. Because then when I was writing my book on addiction, I had read his book on OCD. I know I quote him in The Myth of Normal, but I don't remember the title of his book now. But anyway, he develops this 4-step program. One is called relabel. So let's say you want to wash your hands 100 times because you need to. So Jeffrey will say, you relabel it. I don't need to wash my hand 100 times. I have a belief that I need to wash my hand 100 times. Well, that's all. Or I need to go shopping right now. You relabel it. I don't need to go shopping right now. I have a belief that I need to go shopping right now. But that creates a distance. That removes it from a ineluctable necessity to the realm of thought, which is what it really is. Because it's true. You don't have to wash your hand 100 times. You just believe that you do. Relabel, you say, or reattribute. You say, this belief that I have to do such and such comes from some old brain circuit in my brain. It's not reality. It's just an old brain circuit with which I'm programmed. And so on. So it's a way of just revisioning this compulsion, whether it's to an addictive behavior or to a compulsive behavior. You see it for what it is. And Schwartz teaches that you do this with mindfulness, with mindful awareness. So you write this stuff down mindfully. So what really changes the brain here is not just repeating these steps, but the mindfulness that accompanies your performance of those steps.
What do you think of writing and journaling? Do you think it is essential in being able to externalize our thoughts and putting them on paper?
What is important is self-expression, whatever form it takes. And for a lot of people, journaling, and I mean, how many people do you know, or are there people in your life to whom you can, with no hesitation whatsoever, no shyness, no holding back, no shame whatsoever, just spill the contents of your mind? And most people don't have too many people like that in their lives. And sometimes even with our most intimate partners, there's stuff that we're still withholding and so on. If you keep a journal and you don't censor yourself, then just expressing it and then actually seeing it now puts you in the position of an observer of your mind. You're not just totally identified with the contents. Now you're observing the contents. Now who are you? You're the observer here now. So yeah, I think journaling is a great thing to do. I wish I had the discipline.
I know, me too. I start and then I'm just full of good intention and then I'm just, oh God, I'll just think the thoughts and I just speak them.
Well, you know what? So I don't even try anymore, but in my 40s, I'm going to journal. So I start a nice, fresh new booklet and I journal for 3 or 4 days and then I put it aside. And a half a year later, I say, I'm going to journal. Then I buy a new booklet. So I have 6 or 7 booklets, with each of them with 5 pages in it.
I'm exactly the same. It's like the nice concept of a nice new fresh notebook. Everyone loves buying a nice notebook with all these intentions and oh my God, yeah, exactly the same. Yeah. And then they become a book for the shopping list that gets kind of torn out every so often.
Exactly.
No, I mean, I think as well it's really interesting about the attachment because again, you've made me really think about boarding schools and nurseries and things like au pairs and nannies. And do you think that a child needs that attachment to their mother, or do you think they can have, almost like a surrogate mother who can step in and fulfill that role?
Well, so I mentioned this book, The Continuum Concept, about this Aboriginal tribe. There's this concept of allo-mothering. Allo means other. And nobody's mothered on their own. There are always other women around and other adults around to help with the parenting task. It's called allo-mothering. So the birth mother was still there and was primary, but there was all these others. Now, if the birth mother can't be there, but there's another parenting figure of any gender who can provide what the birth mother needs to provide, which is very difficult, by the way. Because the child is used to the body of the mother for 9 months inside the uterus. But yeah, that child can be perfectly okay, as long as they get those needs met. It doesn't have to be the birth mother. Ideal it is the birth parents, but it doesn't have to be. Now, boarding schools, many children, they necessarily experience it as an abandonment. They don't know. They don't want to be at home. And somebody very rightly said that the British Empire was built on the playing fields of Eton. It's true, because all the cruelty, all the racism, all the exertion of force, all the lack of heart, all the desire to dominate, that was necessary to build an empire at the cost of murdering hundreds of thousands of people abroad and stealing their lands and stealing their goods and subjugating them. The psychological mechanism that were built in the British public schools, so-called, where the boys in this case were mercilessly beaten, shamed, punished, bullied, and often sexually exploited. And yeah, that's what builds that kind of character. So the British boarding school, and you know, there's movements here in Britain, I know that, of boarding school survivors. Men, maybe for women as well. I'm not so familiar with that, but I know men who've had to go through all kinds of remedial work and join support groups just to help overcome the impacts of the boarding schools on them. And then this whole idea of the stiff upper lip, what is that all about? Have you ever met an infant with a stiff upper lip?
No.
I mean, infants cry because crying is a communication. In fact, it's the only communication that they have. When they have needs that are not being met, they will cry. And essentially, when you impose the stiff upper lip ethic on a child, what you're saying to them is, your vulnerability doesn't matter to me. I just want a facade from you and compliance, but I don't want you. Well, how toxic can you get?
Yeah. And it's actually that notion of when a child cries, it's hearing them and not saying, oh, please stop crying, because that's the default reaction of a lot of parents.
Well, if you look at the Aboriginal tribes, they don't want to let their kids cry. When I say let them, it's not that they forbid them. They don't create situations where the kid has to cry. I mean, a kid might cry because they stubbed their toe or something, but not crying because loss of attachment, not crying because they're not being picked up, not crying because they're left to sleep on their own, not crying because they're abandoned. And so this whole idea of the crying child is itself an artifact of what we call civilization. And by the way, there was a study years ago where it showed that in Britain there's a higher incidence of crying kids than in many other countries.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is. And I think the average, I think it's something like 25% of American women went back to work after 2 weeks of giving birth. Some
in the
alarming
United States,
statistic.
because of economic and racial conditions, 25% of women go back to work within 2 weeks of giving birth. Now, physiologically speaking, the child needs to be with the mother for at least 9 months, because the human beings are born much less mature than other mammals. For example, a horse can run on the first day of life. And that's because human beings have larger heads. The female pelvis of the human is narrower. So we can't wait for full development to be born. We have to be born prematurely. And so the British American anthropologist Ashley Montagu talks about exterogestation. Exterogestation being gestation outside the womb, as opposed to interogestation in the womb. And it takes about 9 months for the enzymes and the organisms, the organs and body systems to develop in the human that in other mammals are present at birth. And that demands the body of the mother, close physical contact and breastfeeding with the body of the mother. That's called extra-gestation. Now, in fact, if you look at hunter-gatherer groups that are still following the evolutionary pathway, the average age of weaning is between 3 and 5, usually around 4. That doesn't mean the child doesn't need anything else, but that the mother breast is still available to them. So that's a need of the child. So when you send women back because of poverty to work within 2 weeks, it means a massive abandonment of the infant with huge implications for child development, brain development, personality development, and it's a harbinger of all kinds of future problems. And even the 25% that don't go back to work get so much bad advice about let your baby cry it out and all this kind of stuff. So basically in Western culture, there's a massive unwitting, unwilled, and with the best of goodwill on the part of loving parents, abandonment of the child's needs.
Mm.
And we're not blaming parents here. They do their best, but do their best in a culture that doesn't support them providing for their child's needs the way the child was prepared for by evolution.
Mm. I think it's also that concept of trauma that a lot of people misunderstand. And I think it's a term that, as you so rightly outline in your book, there's capital T trauma, which is what most people focus on, but there's little t trauma.
Yeah. So, so trauma, as I wonder if I'm getting tired of saying it. Maybe, but trauma is literally what it means. It's the Greek word for wound or wounding. So trauma is the wound that you sustain. It can be sustained by a whole number of incidents, some of which are what we call the big T traumatic incidents, like physical, sexual, emotional abuse, poverty, racism, parent dying, parent being jailed, a parent being addicted, a parent being mentally ill, a rancorous divorce, violence in the family, a parent beating another parent. These are traumatic events that leave deep wounds in the child. Those are the big T traumatic events. But as we've been talking, there's another way to wound children, which is not to impose these overt traumatic events on them, but not to meet their needs. So children can be wounded not because bad things happened to them that shouldn't have, but because of the good things that should have happened not happening. Mm. So being seen, being responded to when you cry, being held, being understood, having your emotions validated, feeling safe in a relationship, feeling unconditionally accepted and loved and just appreciated for who you are, not for what you show or provide or how you please others, but just because you exist. These are genuine needs of the human child, determined by evolution. We can live without them, and we do, but we do so in a way that's lesser than our capacities as human beings, and often it leads to all kinds of pathologies.
Mm. Yeah, and I think, again, this dichotomy between attachment and authenticity, we get so removed from our authentic selves.
Yeah.
And then life becomes this journey in search of who we are authentically.
Well, it's interesting. Dante's Inferno, which is one of my favorite books, begins with, midway through life, I lost my way. And all of a sudden he starts wondering, who am I? And what am I doing here? How did I get here? And he can't find a way back. So what does he have to do? He has to descend into hell. What's hell? All his unresolved, deep, traumatized emotions. Greed, envy, hatred, rage, all this kind of stuff. And he has to go through all that stuff to find himself again. At some point he lost himself. Now, we lose ourselves because our guides couldn't guide us in the right direction. And our guides were the adults in our lives, our parents, our teachers, our leaders. And if they don't guide us in the right direction, we get lost. And then we have to take on the job of finding ourselves, which itself could be a very rewarding journey. It's also very difficult for a lot of people.
I think especially when we are a nation that seems to be addicted, or a world that seems to be addicted to dopamine. And so often
addicted to
dopamine.
Oh, dopamine,
You know, and
Yeah.
Anna Lemke's book, which I've heard you talk about, the Dopamine Nation, in which we're sort of always seeking those false highs, and they're, to me, just getting us further and further away from our authentic selves.
Yeah.
And so we're surrounded by, you know, all this stimuli that's actually just completely negating that sense of self.
Well, there's technological company in the States, literally it's called the Dopamine Lab. And it's all about how to get cell phones and technology to ignite our dopamine circuits, to give a sense of vitality and aliveness and purpose and meaning through external means, which means you never get enough. So the more you get, the more you need to get. It's typical addictive stuff. It's actually called the Dopamine Lab. And they target the circuits in the brain that are most prone to get addicted. But the whole society is like that. So that, you know, like the pornography addict, or the cell phone addict. It's not the cell phone that they're addicted to as such. What they're addicted to is the hit of dopamine they get, this chemical that's necessary for a sense of vitality and curiosity and seeking and aliveness. That's why. It's interesting. This last summer, for the second time, I did a 2-week digital sabbatical, where no cell phone, no email, you know, internet. And I'm telling you, it was interesting to watch myself, because even though my cell phone was on airplane mode so that nothing was going to come through, several times a day I still reached for it. It's like there's a body memory that I gotta grab this thing. Why? There's nothing on it, you know. But if it was on, I'd look at it and get, you know. And why? Because who's gonna write me? Did so and so write me back? And if they write me back, with what attitude did they write me back? Or what's happening here? Or who's winning this? Or who's losing that? You know, and all of which is pretty irrelevant to the present moment. But I just need that hit. And this society is adept at giving us those dopamine hits without in any way helping us to find that inner vitality, which would mean that we wouldn't have to looking for it from the outside.
Mm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I don't do social media at all myself, and I'm an anomaly in my generation.
Yeah.
But I can't help but feel that, again, I get a sense of abandonment when a friend doesn't reply to a message within a few hours.
Yeah.
And I can't fathom the thought of being exposed to this kind of global platform where everyone can see your stuff, and suddenly you're exposed to. It's just so overwhelming and stressful, and I think it's stripping it back. And as you go and look at these, you know, indigenous tribes and things, and looking at how they live and why are they more content? Because they don't have all this external stimuli and this dopamine.
I'm thinking of the days of carrier pigeons, you know?
Yeah.
You wouldn't be anxiously, oh my God, they still haven't responded, because your carrier pigeon will take a week to get to the other. So I think what we've gained in speed, we've lost in presence.
I agree. And I think it's getting worse, isn't it? That's the trouble.
Well, especially if you have kids in the younger generation, they're deeply in trouble. If you look at their brain circuits on brain scans, those brain circuits that have to do with insight and rational decision making and emotional connection, they are impaired in kids who've been on too much social media. You can see it on brain scans. It's actually a culturally imposed impairment of the brain.
So would your advice be for parents now to really limit any kind of media device, social media?
No, I wouldn't limit it. I would totally limit
Ban it.
Ban it, yeah.
Yeah.
If I had small kids these days, I wouldn't let them go near a machine. Not for years. I'd make them play outside with a puddle and a stick. And they would be very happy doing that, by the way. And then they learned how to entertain themselves and be comfortable with themselves. Yeah. And I give them lots of contact, so they don't have to they don't have to look for sense of connection on the internet, because they're getting it from real people.
Yeah.
So for young kids going into advanced childhood, I wouldn't even let them near it. And you know what? Then they're going to lose out. No, they're not. When the time comes, they'll pick it up in a day, you know.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it is scary when you see parents just handing a 2 or 3-year-old a telephone or an iPad and they know what to do with it immediately.
Yeah.
It's just, like you said, their brains are being rewired.
Well, and you can understand the parents because they're so stressed. And that device offers the parents like a surrogate babysitter. So no, you don't have to. But you know, there's a friend of mine or acquaintance of mine who studies the impact of iPhones and technology on kids, and she says now that she sees mothers. Now, changing a baby's diaper can be a fussy kind of thing. Give a kid one of these little machines, you can do anything to them. So the mother gives the child this iPhone, kid is happy, and the mother easily changes the diaper. What's lost is the interaction. What's lost is that interconnection which triggers in the child's brain a release of love chemicals like oxytocin and endorphin. The kid is really missing out. But the mother's job has become easier. So, and mothers being so isolated and so stressed in this culture, who can blame them? So it's not a matter of mom blaming. It's a question of pointing out that this whole system just doesn't support parenting the way nature would have intended it.
Mm. I'm curious, Gabor, as we're speaking, at what point in your life do you think that you really found your authentic self?
This morning at 5. It's
or have you indeed found your authentic self, or is it a constant journey?
It's a process. But there was always something in me that, and I think there's something in everybody, but I've been kind of aware of it, that I just had the need to be myself, and which meant that when I wasn't being myself, I noticed it, and I suffered because of it. And it takes many forms. Like, I always had this urge to write. And I talk about this in my book, that sometimes I would sit there, there'd be like some kind of a weird sensation at the pit of my belly, and I didn't know what that was about. And then a voice would come into my head, say, writing, because I wasn't writing. Now, for me, writing is important. For somebody else, it's something else. But I listened to that voice, you know, and I wasn't a doctor to start with. I was a high school teacher, although I grew up wanting to be a physician. Some morning I just woke up and I said, no, I got to do this medical school thing. And I did. So I tended to listen to these internal voices when they came along. And right now, without going into too many details, there's some terrible tragedies happening in the world. Children are dying every day. And to speak out about it is to invite a lot of criticism. And like, I'm Jewish, and I get a lot of criticism from fellow Jews, a lot of appreciation from some, but a lot of criticism and even venom from others for being a traitor, for speaking up on behalf of freedom for Palestinians. But I made a decision a long time ago that, to me, the authenticity of just, I'm not saying this makes me right, but if I see a truth as I perceive it, I have a need to speak it. And if the consequences that some people won't like me, I'll live with that. I don't like it, but I'll live with it. So for me, this drive for authenticity has just been very strong in my life, and which is really what allowed me to do a lot of my work, because so much of what I do is controversial. I'm getting a prize in a couple of months. Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, has got this annual prize for controversy. And this year I'm going to get it, you know. And my point is, though, that, of course, I should have got it years ago, but, you know, anyway, they finally got it together to give it to me. But the point is, what's controversial is totally contextual. If in the year 1100 I asserted that the Earth was round and it revolved around the sun, that would have been controversial. So the controversial nature of something doesn't say anything about the truth or lack of it. It speaks to the context in which that particular statement is made. And so for me, just saying what I understood to be the case, whether in medicine or politics, wherever, just for some reason became more important than how it's received and how the people might see it. And I think the people, when you look at the studies, the people who are most realized or self-realized or comfortable with themselves are people who don't live a life that's designed to please others. That, they may be part of a culture, but they don't necessarily conform to it. But they rather insist on being themselves. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I can ask you this, have you had the experience of really being yourself and being satisfied with it, even though others may not have approved of it at that time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think for me, starting this podcast and coming out into the open with the fact that I was suffering with really chronic OCD and all these thoughts that were going through my head, and I have an eating disorder, and actually being open and honest about it instead of trying to mask it all was a big step. I don't think I'm fully there yet, but I think that level, as you speak about the judgment, the shame, the guilt, those emotions were so crippling at times and still are at times. And I'm at an age where most of my friends are getting married and having babies, and I'm not on that trajectory. And I think a lot of that self-acceptance can come with age and maturity. And I have obviously been lucky enough to do a lot of work on myself, but it's ongoing.
It is ongoing, and that's true for all of us, I think. At the same time, though, if you looked at your sense of self-appreciation now as compared to before you took that step of becoming public, how would you compare it?
Yeah, a completely different person, probably.
Yeah, a totally different person, yeah. So it's actually a kindness to oneself to seek that authenticity.
Yeah, and I really agree with that, because I think when we resort to those self-punitive behaviors, and when you get to the stage in an addiction or something like OCD or the food where you recognize the behaviors are just punishing yourself, and actually that learning to, it's okay to be kind to yourself.
Do you mind if I rephrase that?
No, go for it.
There's no self-punishing. It's self-soothing. When you're looking for safety, you're not punishing yourself. It's actually a way of trying to love yourself in the wrong way. Now, it might have negative consequences, if that's what you mean. That's true. But there's no intent to punish. There's an intent actually to find something that you need. Yeah,
and that's why you say addiction is so often the best, worst option for children, especially.
Yeah, but I just encourage people not to use, is to be compassionate towards themselves. And you're not punishing yourself. You might not like the effects of it, but the intent is not to punish. Is it?
Well, when will I get to the stage where I can be content with, okay, for example, nourishing myself consistently and not loathing my body, and with the OCD not exercising myself to the point of like feeling so depleted that it's okay to do a mediocre workout. I don't have to be the best, the one who's always striving for this perfectionism. How?
When?
Yeah, how and when?
Well, when people ask a question, very often they're making a statement. So if I rephrased, or if you rephrased, your question is a statement, what would you be saying about yourself? Because you're making a statement.
So I'm saying that I still do resort to those behaviors that are quote-unquote self-soothing.
That's a given, but there's something more to it than that. It's also, I have trouble believing that I'll ever get over it. No?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. That's the statement that you're making. So my answer is, I will not tell you when. I would explore with you why you have trouble believing it. And what is the source of that belief that you might never get there. So that's much more interesting than me giving you a date. I could say, well, it's going to be February the 3rd, 2027, 3 in the morning, but it's meaningless. It's much more important to explore where your self-doubt comes from and a certain implied sense of perhaps futility, because those are present, embedded in that question. And so if I were to work with you on this question, I wouldn't be trying to say when. I'd say, well, where do these beliefs come from? What do they represent? These self-limiting beliefs, which is what they are.
Mm. And then that takes us back, to the childhood and abandonment.
Yes, but just recognize that intellectually it wouldn't get you there.
Mm.
So, for example, I don't know where you want to take this, but if I were to ask you, this belief that I will not get there, where's that? How you feel in your body when you hold that belief?
I feel tense in my stomach, and I can feel it's like a knot.
Okay, right. Then I'd work with that in the present moment. You did not invite me here for a therapy session. So.
No, but it's cute. I'm interested because I think a lot of people feel that you get to a certain stage often in a recovery journey, and you sort of suddenly you're like, am I going to get to that take that leap? Like it's like I'm sort of teetering on the edge of the water, but I can't fully dive in and just surrender.
I totally understand, and intellectually you already know where all this came from, but you're still holding it in your body. So I'd work with your body to help release that tension, which is really what that belief is all about. So the answer is here in the present moment.
Yeah.
Working with what's with us here right now. So that's how to go about working with it.
So, and in that respect, you mean sort of like more somatic type body work?
Yeah, I would include body. Yeah. You always have to work with the body. Not just with the body, but certainly the body always has to be a part of the therapeutic process because that's where we hold all this stuff.
And I think that's, again, like it goes back to that, the mistake that we make of always focusing on kind of curing the mind and or prescribing medicine.
Yeah.
It's either or. And as you've spoken about ADHD and written about it, it's, so often people are prescribed very, very heavy duty medicine, but it's not always the best option.
Yeah. Well, look, I've taken medicines and they've helped me at times, both for ADHD and for depression. I think they have their place as stopgaps, but they're not the answer to anything. They deal with symptoms, surface manifestations, rather than fundamental dynamics. And I think, unfortunately, most physicians are trained simply to hand out the pills, but never to go beyond it. And not realizing that the biology of the brain and the body is actually programmed by life experience. And if you change life experiences, so will your physiology. So that medications, I think they can be useful at times. I think we overprescribe them. We prescribe them for too long, and we don't do what else that needs to be done. I'm not going to be totally against medication because I can see their value in situations, but in this society, there's a unbalanced over-reliance on medications.
And I mean, in my eyes, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I see them as more of a plaster than a cure.
And the plaster may be necessary sometimes, but it's not sufficient.
Yeah.
You have to go for the healing as well.
You do a lot of work with parents and children. I mean, at whatever stage. I mean, you've done a few retreats, I think, haven't you, with sort of adults, whether they're both adults, but people can say come, and you deliver courses with adults and their children, or...
Well, so my son Daniel and I, who helped me write Myth of Normal, our next book project is called Hello Again, a fresh start for adult children and their parents. And you can just Google us on YouTube, Daniel Gabor Maté, Fresh Start or Adult Children. And you can see us during this process. And we developed a course around it that's available through an American organization called the Commune. I'm not trying to sell you anything. I'm just
No. I'm really interested.
It's available. But also it's going to be a book. And what's interesting is when you watch those videos over the years, I think we filmed the first one probably 6 years ago now. It's been seen by about 400,000 people by now. Even as we're leading this workshop, him and I are at each other's throats. My son and I. So we've had to do a lot of work. Not that we're told at each other's throats, but we trigger each other and we get tense with each other and defensive. So it's an ongoing process. But I think this work between adult children and the parents, for a lot of people, I think it's very helpful.
Well, because when I read about it and when I saw about this Hello Again and the fact that you guys are delivering these seminars effectively, I said to my mum, I really think we could benefit from doing one. And of course, her reaction was sort of, classic, there's nothing wrong with me. The problem all lies with you. And that's always been the problem. Yeah. But for me, the most transformative healing would happen alongside her, I know.
Ideally, yes. But although you also can't, because let's take the tragic scenario that your mother dies this evening. Does that mean his healing no longer is possible for you?
No.
So you don't depend on her.
No.
And to the extent that you try to depend on her, you're defeating yourself. Now, ideally, though, it's very helpful if you both engage in the process. So you could check out this course called Fresh Start from the Commune. You can find it on YouTube, or you actually watch the first hour for free. We do tell people that it works better if both partners are there, but even one person can do it, because you can change the relationship even without the other person moving a muscle. Mm-hmm. That's just how it works.
How was the process of writing The Myth of Normal with Daniel?
How was it? Well, first of all, I couldn't have done it without him. This is my 5th book. I collected 20,000 articles, newspaper reports, scientific articles, filed them. It's been a 10-year labor getting ready for this book. I started to write it, and I decided it's too much. Can't do it. And I gave the money back to the publisher. And then, a year and a half later, all of a sudden it just sprung back into my mind with a new title, and I said, I'm going to do this. And it just demanded to be done. And that's where Daniel came along. And because it was such a big subject and so many topics are covered in it, I needed somebody to rein me in, to give me feedback, to mirror me, to make sure I wasn't being too abstruse for people, to make sure I wasn't being too over-inclusive of all kinds of research, to prove my points, to make it reader-friendly, in other words. And Daniel's a brilliant writer. So literally it was co-written. It's not like he wrote it for me or he just edited my work. It's actually a mutual process. In that process, of course, we went through our stuff, because at times I get tense. At a certain point in writing the book, I began to experience a certain degree of anxiety and even panic, thinking maybe I've bitten off more than I can chew. And when I get tense, I trigger all his own childhood trauma, because I was a very tense father. When I get tense, that affects his nervous system. So that all this stuff came up and we had to talk it through. In the end, it was a beautiful, collaborative, mutually respectful process. But we had our stuff to work through as he was helping me write the book.
Mm. And is that also co-written between the two of you?
Hello Again will be different yet, because Myth of Normal is largely my work, not the writing, but the theoretical work and the science and the experience and the concepts that came from my experience as a person, as a physician, and as a reader of the research. this book will be completely 50-50. So he'll write as much as I will write, and we'll go each other's stuff, but it'll be not Gabor Maté with Daniel. It'll be Daniel and Gabor writing this book.
And finally, Gabor, what advice would you like to leave someone who is on their journey, but they've reached a block and they just think, I can't move forward. I've got to live with this sense of just, mediocrity in my life. And like I said, it's like you're teetering on the brink of change, but you just can't take the plunge, and you've got yourself into a sort of a state where you're feeling okay, but not well.
I would quote myself, because I was in my 40s or so, these intermittent journals that we talked about. I can find one of my journals when I was in my late 40s when I wrote, I feel depressed, I feel frustrated, I feel blocked. I feel I have some creative capacities that I haven't nearly touched yet, and I feel despondent about it. So I think if somebody gets to the point where they think they haven't reached their potential, I congratulate them. It means they haven't. It means that there's something in them that's waiting to be expressed. And Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher, said something about detours and blind alleys. He said sometimes you have to go down blind alleys just to find out that this is not the right road. So if you're blocked, it only means that the direction you're trying to go in is not the right one for you. But it doesn't mean that you can't get to your destination. You just haven't found the way yet. So I always say to people, if you have that sense of frustration and block, good. It means there's something in you that knows that more is available for you. And then you need to get some help.
Yeah.
But that sense of limitation and frustration is a sign that there's something more in you. It's there. It's just waiting for you to find it. And it's just going to take some time. I was 55 when I wrote my first book.
I know, what, when I heard that, it was so inspiring, because I thought, life hasn't begun yet. It's all okay.
Yeah.
And, I know you love that poem, the Larkin poem that I also love.
Yeah.
I'll let you quote it. Go. You can.
Well, I don't know if I can quote it directly, but what is it? I have it on my cell phone.
They fuck you up. It's I mean, yeah. But you very eloquently. I know you can relay it, but it's been such a pleasure.
Thank you. It's really nice to meet you as well.
No, and I really hope that we meet again. And I could talk to you for hours. It's such a fruitful conversation. And you're such a sort of fount of knowledge and wisdom. It's just incredible to have you in this room. So thank you so much for taking the time to come.
My great pleasure. Thank you.